Welcome back, everyone. I think this week is the perfect time for yet another editorial. This time though, we'll actually be delving into a topic directly related to games, rather than the channel itself. What games? The Megaman X series. I know at this point it's probably a bit old, but if you haven't already, you should take some time out to watch Satchbag's Good's breakdown of Mario and Mega Man's transitions into 3D. This editorial is largely a response to that. That video isn't really required to understand this one, but I wouldn't have thought of any of this if it wasn't for his video. It's really good, so you should check it out. Anyway, to sum up the conclusion of his video, he is of the opinion that Mario made a much better transition into 3D with Mario 64 than Mega Man did with X7. And I have to say that I agree. Though I don't particularly love playing Mario 64, mostly because of the stick on the N64 controller, I've always been amazed by the fluid mobility they created with the mechanics. I also very much agree that Mega Man X made a fairly terrible transition into 3D. Part of the problem comes down to the fact that the series had been steadily getting more and more bloated as it continued. They kept adding so many new mechanics and ideas that it eventually felt extremely overwhelming and underexplained. More stuff isn't always the better option, especially if none of it is handled particularly well. On top of that, level designs became progressively more cheap and poorly laid out. Games like X6 had far too many instances where the normal player had no choice but to be hit by enemies, and Reploids to rescue were almost always in really cheap spots. You practically had to know where they were beforehand if you were to save a lot of them. Suffice it to say, Mega Man X had been on a bit of a decline for a while, so X7 was their chance to revitalize the flame before it completely burned out. So why did it fail, and what could they have done to make it work? Bear with me, because this idea might sound a little strange, but I think it should have been more like Demon's Souls and Devil May Cry. First thing to note is that I know DMC3 and the Souls games came after X7, but the mechanics I'll be talking about could have been implemented back in the PS1 era if they'd wanted to. I'm sure Demons May Cry X7 sounds either extremely terrible or like it would rip the heart from the series, but let me break it down for you. Here's what I would have changed to create a 3D Mega Man X game. Well, first things first, the game should have allowed the player to control the camera a la Demon's Souls. Now, it's important to note that fixed cameras were a major part of most Japanese titles at the time X7 released. The Japanese player base was notorious for having trouble controlling both a camera and a character simultaneously. It wasn't until the last 7 or so years that they've really started getting used to it. The camera is easily one of the biggest problems with the controls in X7 though. Not only does a fixed perspective alter your directional inputs as it moves, but it can be terrible for getting a proper look at the platforming sections or enemies. Far too many cheap shots can happen because an enemy backs off screen and you have no way of keeping an eye on them. There are sections in X7 that allow you to have some control over the camera, but it's really sloppy and doesn't do a good job of conveying important information. Along with the ability to control the camera would obviously come an actual lock-on system. Though Mega Man did technically lock onto enemies in X7, he didn't enter a different state when doing so. In other words, there was no strafing. You didn't have to be on the exact same plane as your enemy on all 3 axes, but you still had to be facing them. If you turned around to, say, dodge an attack, you could no longer damage your enemy. It turned combat into a binary dodge-attack pattern that got really repetitive and slowed actual progress through the levels. And on top of that, you had no way of controlling which enemy the lock-on locked onto. The more enemies on screen, the more difficult it became to actually interact with the opponent you wanted to. Demon's Souls, much like a lot of other games, allows you to flick the camera stick in the direction of another enemy to change the lock-on to them. But more importantly, you enter a strafing mode when you lock on. You can still attack enemies while backpedaling, it allows you to block attacks, and dodges are directly relative to enemy actions. Another thing that needed a dose of adrenaline was the overall control. Every action in X7 feels slow and a bit floaty. Character animations are hard to predict because there are so many frames that are used for nothing other than aesthetics. This makes the control feel just a bit laggy because there's so much startup and cooldown on things like jumps and dashes. Not to mention the actual movement itself is just slow overall. The dash hardly does anything to speed you out of the way of enemies. Speaking of dashes, that's actually the core of the system I'm proposing here. The original Mega Man X had amazingly smooth flow once you got accustomed to the mechanics. The ability to dash, dash jump, and both cling to walls and jump from them changed the way you thought about enemy patterns and the environment in general. You had so much twitch mobility in the first 3 X games, especially with the later inclusion of air dashes. So focus on that, and tailor the level and enemy design around it. My mind jumps to Devil May Cry and the trickster style you can use there. That style heavily emphasizes dashing to and from enemies, and even makes use of a teleport mechanic as well as double jumps and wall running. I think mobility is the name of the game here. Get rid of the bottomless pits and other insta-kills. Give levels a lot of space and design them to be traversed in a freeform way. Incentivize crowd control through movement, and instead of platforming feeling more like a puzzle challenge, it should be used more for gaining combat advantages. Make the levels fun to jump around, and give each area a unique feel to the platforming. Combat should back this up by being fast and frenetic, with smart, agile enemies and easily recognizable attacks. You want to be able to know what your enemies are doing while you're kiting around them at a quick pace. I think invincibility frames would be really important here. When you do certain types of dashes, you should get a small chunk of invincibility frames. This not only gives dashes a dual purpose, but it incorporates an inherent rhythm to the way you move. Combat and movement should feel like they're one, and you should be able to chain enemies and control your environment in ways that feel satisfying and natural. As far as attacks themselves go, I believe this should focus more on attacks that work well with the fast pace and wide movement areas. Give X some area of effect attacks, some attacks that home in on enemies or lock onto multiple enemies. Attacks like the normal Buster Shot won't have any homing, but they should therefore be quick so they maintain their usefulness. Then give enemies the same sort of arsenals and give them clear attack tails. Make hits punishing for both you and the enemies, with attacks that can stagger opponents if used correctly. A sort of DMC style air halting effect could be implemented when using certain weapons as well. Some equipment you gain along your journey could modify your movement options too. Maybe a rocket tackle sort of attack that smashes into your enemies could also be used as a long-range air dash for quick escapes. Maybe something like Sting Chameleon's intangibility power-up could exist. The bosses themselves could all be uniquely set up to challenge a few select uses of mechanics. Maybe this guy has tough armor on his front, or that guy's really fast and difficult to lock onto. Maybe another boss can change the terrain. It's all about making them feel different from each other and the normal enemies, while supporting the mechanics. I think there should be mini-bosses as you travel along too. These mini-bosses could still give you new gear to play around with, so that they're more than just a challenge for what you've learned up to that point. I think the actual game design would do well to balance between the linear design of previous games and open, overlapping environments. The Souls series often has environments fold in on themselves. Demon's Souls does this while still providing levels that are overall linear, and you can choose to tackle them in any order just like a Mega Man game. They end up feeling like journeys through progressively changing worlds. It would emphasize the power the end boss Mavericks have when you finally reach them too. Though not inherently a bad thing, the level design in X7 was too linear, and limited spacing players had when in combat. It's much easier to manage both your platforming and your enemies when you have space to breathe. This would also emphasize tension when the game actually does force you to fight in cramped areas. The key to all of this is moderation and balance. Mechanics and ideas should be presented to you naturally and then challenged in as many ways as possible. This sort of design gives players a feeling of freedom for how they tackle things. When all of this comes together as a singular idea, I think it adequately retains the flow and the quick twitch pace of the first few Mega Man X games, but uses modern third-person mechanics to bring things into 3D. It puts player expression in the gameplay on a pedestal, and allows the game to be tackled in a multitude of ways. It doesn't waste time on superfluous mechanics, and gives the player as many choices as possible with as little complexity as possible. You jump, you shoot, you triumph. So I hope this was interesting and articulated well enough. This script was a bit difficult, since it relies on concepts that you have to imagine in action, but hopefully my points came across. But what do you guys think? Do you believe an idea like this would still feel Mega Man enough, or would even be fun? What would you add to this idea, or even replace it with if you think I'm completely wrong? Comment below and have a great week.